evening, everyone. Buenos noches, bonjour, bon dia, buongiorno, ni hao, memenjes, dobre utro, namaste, sawadi, chowim, manganang hapun, como ye, sopa wanang sung, assalamu alaikum, privet, guten tag, kalimara, and as they say in Hebrew, shalom. My name is Kevin Booker Jr., and I am the organizer for this event this evening. Thank you for joining this insightful conversation this evening. In 2005, 16 years ago, when I was teaching at Buckley High School in Hartford, Connecticut, I had students from 64 different countries. In order to build a connection with them, I decided to start morning announcements and begin the announcements each day by greeting them in their native language. I also featured different cultural traditions throughout the year as a way to ensure everyone felt included and to reinforce that our heritage is a valuable asset to our community. In the process, I have learned that when you embark on a new experience with the goal of giving back, you end up learning from your students. Tonight's event, this is an insightful event. But one thing what really resonated with me is a quote by Lana Condor. And she said, I think there is a misconception that all Asian American experiences are the same. My experiences with my family and the way they wanted me to know my culture are not the same as others. Lana Condor. So tonight's conversation and the theme of the discussion this evening is there is no single story. We will discuss the themes in the book, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, connected to race, immigration, assimilation, pop culture, and escaping stereotyped roles. And we have a phenomenal moderator this evening, Yukio Ida, who's going to lead us through this incredible experience. So let's give her a round of applause. Yukio Ida, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, One Book, One Region, for selecting such a timely book. And thank you, Anne, for the introduction and having Groton Public Library put this on, and Kevin for getting us hyped up for this wonderful panel of speakers. Good evening, everyone. Like Kevin said, I'm Yukio Ida, and I'm a parent of a middle schooler in West Hartford, Connecticut, a community organizer and DEI consultant with a focus on racial justice. I'm also an immigrant from Japan, and our family is a proud, beautiful, and just sometimes, complex mix of race, language, and culture. Tonight, we have an amazing lineup of panelists with such a rich and diverse background. And as our panel title indicates, there is no single story of being Asian in America, and I'm so excited to hear from our wonderful panelists. So tonight we have, and if the panelists can raise their hands, Judy Cheng is an educator from New York City. Brian Chong is a political organizer in New Britain, Connecticut. Carl Lee is an artist and actor from Connecticut, but currently located in Florida. And Olivia Wu is a student and organizer at Connecticut College. And Cynthia, are you able to join us on the panel as a participant, or?
Yes, I just rushed back from where I was.
Thank you so much. Weren't sure if you were going to be able to make it, but Cynthia.
I wasn't sure myself.
But great.
I tend to spread myself. I spread myself a little thin, so I'm learning.
Yes, no, thank you. So Cynthia is a writer, educator, activist, and she was raised in Boston's Chinatown, and she writes extensively about it. And this is a great connection to have with Interior Chinatown. And so before we get to the panelists, I just, a quick background about being Asian and Asian American in our landscape now. And so the last couple of years with COVID has had a profound impact on our Asian American Pacific Islander community, just between the pandemic, amplifying the inequities that have always existed, and the pain and harm caused by racism and gun violence on our Pan-Asian community members in Atlanta, Indianapolis, California, New York, all across the nation, and even in our local communities. So anti-Asian racism did not start with COVID. We've been targeted repeatedly throughout history, whether it's the US government illegally annexing the Kingdom of Hawaii, Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, Vincent Chin, South Asian, Sikh, and Muslim community members being targeted after 9/11, SARS epidemic causing similar anti-Asian sentiments as now, and yet we continue to heal and grow and advocate for a just society, not only for our community, but also with others who are experiencing systemic inequities and oppression. And I think all of this has brought a renewed interest in learning more about and understanding our experience. So thank you all for being here. And thank you so much for taking the time to really listen and really understand and really see us as individuals. So you've all read Interior Chinatown, and although it's fictional, it gave a very good window into the life of a young man in Chinatown. And again, this is just one Asian American experience out of many. So this session really is about showcasing the richness of what it means to be Asian American. And before we dive in to hear from the panelists, just going to share a quick context. It's very hard to do because a couple hundred years of history here in America as Asians, but just going to give you a quick context to the AAPI community. Then we'll connect all that with the themes from the book and with the personal stories from our panelists. So let me quickly share my screen. All right, and look at our wonderful and beautiful panelists here, yay. All right, so slide 1. So this is from the census, and Asian alone population was the fastest growing racial group from 2000 to 2019. And, there are more than 22 million Asian Americans belonging to over 50 ethnic groups who speak over 100 different languages. And this is also a local trend in Connecticut. And here is the Asian and Pacific Islander population in the United States. I don't know if you're able to see, but these are all the different ethnic groups under the Asian and Pacific Islander label. And as you can see from this chart, there is no one Asian or Pacific Islander American history, identity, or experience. Some of us came to the US as highly skilled workers or on student visas. Some of us came to the US as refugees, and some of us have been here for 5 generations, while some of us just got here yesterday. And this map was created by Dr. Jason Chang, who is the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies at UConn. As you can see, this is New London County, but it is the 4th largest concentration of Asian Americans in New London out of all the different counties in Connecticut. And statewide, there's about 5% of us. And I think New London County mirrors that percentage. All right, so then let's take a quick look at New London County and all the different ethnicities that is under the Asian American label that and these are your community members. So Chinese, except Taiwanese, is the largest ethnic group, and then Filipino, Asian Indian, and so on and so forth. So again, there is a wide range of community members in New London County. Let's see, and the next slide. So this is the 2021 town profile for Groton, Connecticut. And it is put together by CT Data Collaborative and Advanced CT. And this is the breakdown of just the different racial groups in Groton. And Asian, again, mirrors somewhat the state average of 5%. All right. And lastly, so I've been saying Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander and saying AAPI, but the language around this identifying label has been evolving. And before the term Asian American was coined in the late 60s to unite all Asian identities as a collective political power, we would use our ethnic groups. So for example, I would say I'm Japanese American and someone else would say I'm Chinese American, I'm Filipino American. But when we talked about, our identity, that's what we used was our ethnic groups. But labels and acronyms change over time, and labels are problematic at times and very complex. So especially when you take into consideration all the different ethnic groups that are under this label of Asian American. So I think, right now, the term AAPI is what is commonly used in a lot of like the official documents, but there are, just Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander American, Asian American and Pacific Islander, AAPI, which is most commonly used. Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander is the AANHPI. And if you think about it, Native Hawaiians, their experience are very similar to the indigenous population. And, they have their own language. They were annexed by the US government, the mainland government. So, it's a complex label. We also have Asian Pacific Islander Desi American to indicate that the South Asian population, and here again, Asian Pacific Islander, South Asian American. So as you can see, we are such a complex group of people. And tonight, we have representation from mostly East Asia. We don't have Pacific Islander or South Asian Americans, but our panelists will be able to share their stories. Even though they are East Asian, they are all very different. So thank you so much for sitting through some of this learning opportunity. I'm a former teacher, so some of this stuff really I so enjoy. So thanks for sticking with me, everyone. So now we get to really hear from our wonderful panelists. And so first, the theme of identity. I think the theme of identity is a big one in this book. And so I'm going to throw out the question to the panelists. And you have 3 minutes because we have a large group of panelists and we want to hear from everyone. So again, everyone will have 3 minutes or so, and I'll raise my hand when your time is almost up to wrap up. So yeah, how do you identify after hearing all of that about these various labels and ethnicities? How do you identify? And when did you notice that your identity mattered? So feel free.
You want me to start?
Sure, Cynthia, go ahead. I'm starting 3 minutes.
My name is Cynthia Yi, and I grew up in Chinatown. So my first identity said I was Chinese, not American, because I grew up I'm older than all of you, during the 1950s, right after the Chinese Exclusion Act, on a very special street called Hudson Street. If you're familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese men were allowed to come to work. You have overtones of that right now, but not to have families. We want your labor, we want your brain, but we don't want you to settle down. We don't want to have children. Very special law, 1945, the War Brides Act, allowed wives to come. Suddenly, these Chinese men could have families on Hudson Street, not just live in boarding houses, not just be sojourners. And I was one of the children born. And many of us had sisters that were left behind because of the creation of the Taiwanese creation of the paper son system to circumvent the Chinese Exclusion Act. So my identity as a child was very strongly Chinese, and I felt very much that I grew up in a loving paradise because I didn't feel odd. Okay. The minority were white people, all right, and Black people, all right. And the only white people I knew were on television. You could turn that off, right? And they were my teachers who I loved. And they were the people who work in the department stores that I had to help my mother translate. I had to translate for her. And so I was at a very young age able to understand two cultures and two languages because my mother needed me to translate for her. And translation isn't just culture, isn't just language. You're understanding the salesgirl's thoughts, and I understood my mother's thoughts, especially when she tried to bargain with the salesperson. I was very embarrassed by that. So did you want me to say something about the book? I love this book. I picked it up March at the beginning of the pandemic, and I shared with the panelists that I said, oh, here we go again. Scapegoating is going to begin. I'm a Chinatown kid, so I have radar for when the prejudice and the violence starts arriving. Okay, and it's not new to me. So,
okay. Thank you. And, and hopefully we can weave in more of the book as we go along. But yeah, identity, it's a big one. It's one that I've struggled with. So thank you for your experience. Carl?
Yeah. This one's a little tough for me. I think I grew up kind of a little bit oblivious to it. There weren't many Asians in my community. I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut. I now identify more with being Asian, American, and queer mostly. I actually don't really enjoy labels so much, but that's what I would identify with most now. But otherwise, I feel like as a child, I was pretty oblivious to things like that. I was one of those kids who didn't realize a lot of things until I got older and went to college, and college really changed everything in regards to my identity, because there was built-in communities there for everybody. At least for me, I went to UConn. Yeah.
Was there ever a time, Carl, that you felt that you were Asian, or was there a time that kind of hit you that, oh my gosh, I'm maybe Asian?
I think because there weren't that many Asian people, I kind of always felt like I was an outsider in multiple ways. Just like, even if I wasn't Asian, I would have felt like an outsider. And then on top of that, I looked different. And so that's one thing I couldn't hide, so I kind of noticed that pretty much right away, that I remember even having to practice not being Asian almost, I remember trying to walk a certain way and talk a certain way. Yeah, I don't know. It's really weird to look back and try to remember those things for me.
Yes, thank you.
I'm happy
Brian?
to go next.
Oh yeah, Olivia, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Wu. I'm actually calling from my college dorm. I'm a student at Connecticut College. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as Southeast Asian. My parents are from Malaysia, so they're Malaysian Chinese. I was born and raised in Connecticut, so I resonate with Carl's story. Growing up in a predominantly white suburban town in Connecticut, I knew I was Asian, but I think being an innocent, naive kid, I would always try to just fit in. And so, yes, there were times growing up where I experienced like microaggressive comments, but at that time, I didn't even know what that was or how to deal with it, because my parents are not Asian American. It's my younger sister and I first experiencing what it's like to be American and also Asian American. And so, unfortunately, we weren't equipped with the knowledge or the tools on how to address those situations when they came up growing up. And so, kind of like Carl, I never really dealt with it until I came into college and tapped into critical race theory, took my first ever Intro to Asian American course, which was, I believe, Khan's first ever Asian American Studies course they offered just last year. And so, kind of tapping into that and then taking the knowledge I learned within the classroom and sharing it with my peers and just sharing my voice and growing into myself, my identity, and being proud of who I am.
Great, thank you. I feel like college really is a pivotal point for a lot of Asian and Asian Americans. Yeah, thank you. And it took Connecticut College until now to get an Asian American course. Oh. And Brian, did you want to?
Yes, I'm more than happy to. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I am born and raised in Hong Kong. I am in Connecticut. I'm starting my 8th year in Connecticut as a student on an F1 visa. That is the standard foreign student visa. People come here on. I went to a high school in Connecticut, and I just graduated from Wesleyan this past May. So I definitely resonate a lot with Carl on being around Middletown. I personally adore it a lot. And I definitely resonate with what Olivia said. I don't think Wesleyan has that. There was a massive push over the last couple of years to create a minor, I'm pretty sure, something like that, a course cluster on Asian American, and that was Asian American history, and that was a very significant fight that a lot of our friends and allies back at Wesleyan were a part of. But back to myself, I definitely primarily identify as a Hong Konger, and I probably identify a little bit more with I guess maybe perhaps a first-gen immigrant experience, given that my parents and family all just like from Hong Kong, and but also I will say that having been here for around 7-8 years now, especially in the last year, I've noticed more and more people just straight up assuming that I'm from Connecticut, which I am both heartened by and also sort of weirded out about, because I am grateful that I'm being seen as one of everyone else, but also at the same time, it is definitely weird. And if you hear my bit of a British twang, that's sort of from the fact that I'm from Hong Kong, and some of my family went to college in the UK, but obviously I don't speak perhaps very similarly to, I think, the median Asian American, and I think going to high school, that was that made me easy to single out, I think, to be made fun of sometimes, and sometimes in good humor and sometimes not so much. I've been definitely called like names and had my last name be made fun of. That was my first time, ever being in a environment where my identity was not the majority, right? Hong Kong is 99% Han Chinese, and now I'm here in white Connecticut, and so that was really, really salient. And now as a political organizer, I've canvassed, knocked on doors, made phone calls for candidates all around Connecticut. And the very first time knocking doors in a suburban neighborhood, I really felt I don't think I've ever felt more foreign to a place than doing that. Just the fear of someone opening up, looking at you weird, and deciding that you are a threat to them. So yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think in the last couple of years, all our sense of physical safety has really intensified. So thank you, and keep being a political organizer. That's great. Thank you. And Judy.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm really excited to be here. I'm very grateful for the Groton Public Library for having this event, and I'm in such good company. I would identify myself as a Chinese American daughter of immigrants from Shanghai, China. I was born and raised in Manhattan's Chinatown, near there. And my parents spent more of their lives in Manhattan than they did in their hometown of Shanghai. So for many years, growing up, I was considered first generation Asian American. However, I feel we should give credit to that pioneer generation who came before us and who have spent the majority of their lives in the US, forging a path for their children to go to college and get good jobs. I grew up in public schools in New York City. And when I was a child, there really weren't many white people in the neighborhood. It was a mix of Black, Puerto Rican, and some Eastern European, like Yugoslavian and Ukrainians. So I don't know why I didn't consider them white, but my first experience with a fellow student who was white wasn't until high school. So all throughout middle school, high school, and college, I was exposed to a very diverse community of students. And just pop culture, you know, as a child, I loved watching shows like Little House on the Prairie and Charlie's Angels and I Dream of Jeannie, most of which had white characters. And it wasn't until The Cosby Show became really popular that I realized, people of color have a place in pop culture too. And it really wasn't until I saw Karate Kid or old Bruce Lee movies that I thought, wow, my face looks just like theirs. And this is cool that Kairi Tong is on, you know, the news every night. But it's been slow coming for more Asian faces on media. So there's still a long way to go, I think. When I was in college at State University of New York in Binghamton, we had an Asian American social club, and they had organized a film showing of Who Killed Vincent Chin. If you haven't seen that film, it's actually available on YouTube, and I highly recommend watching it. That was my first experience and interaction with anti-Asian violence. The voice of Lily Chin, Vincent Chin's mother, her personality, her demeanor reminded me so much of my own mother's. And that was the start of my journey into anti-racism. So I'm very grateful to be here, and I can't wait to chat with the rest of you about other things.
Great, thank you. And again, there is no one story, right? Cynthia and her Chinatown growing up and is so different than many of us who grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood or, you know, have come here on a student visa. And so I appreciate, again, just the wide range that we encompass. And so, you know, like in the book, there are so many roles that that is mentioned, right? So roles like background Oriental male, generic Asian male number one, Asiatic seductress, Kung Fu guy, delivery guy, disgraced son, and striving immigrant, and even nameless Asian woman. And do you ever feel, you know, that your identity is at odds, right? Is what's perceived or stereotyped as being Asian, and these roles that you are supposed to play. You know, there's a big disconnect, I feel like, in, you know, the perception and the stereotypes and who we strive to be. And, you know, and I think the Willis Wu struggles with all the different roles that he has to try to get through and what's perceived. So, you know, if anyone wants to tackle that one. Cynthia.
We must be on the same wavelength. It's the exact page that I had bookmarked. And I love the title Interior Chinatown. I think I mentioned it too, and it's so clever. I love this book because Interior Chinatown is a state of heart and a state of mind. It's a safe place. I meet many suburban young people when they're in identity search, they head to Chinatown. The founder of the UMass Boston Asian American Studies Department, Peter Kong, was a youth when I was a young activist, and he gravitated to the Asian American Resource Workshop. My generation founded most of the organizations in Boston's Chinatown that are social justice organizations, and they're the children of garment workers. People don't make that connection. They think garment workers is ancient history. Activism is modern. No, they are the children of garment workers. And actually, I write about a piece called My Mama's Back. It's about my mother sewing. She was a garment worker. But the note I have on what you just said about these roles, twin dragon, wizened Chinaman, guy in a soiled shirt. My note is to myself, because besides being a writer and a Chinatown girl, all right, so to speak, I am a teacher. So I'm in touch with youth, young teachers from I teach college kids. I teach first grade. I teach kindergarten. My specialty is early childhood. So I wrote this note. The danger comes when we and our young children believe in the stereotypes. They believe it, okay? As the only possibility for them in their lives. If you have children, that's all they see. The danger is when we ourselves believe it. Chinatown was different in that you had what we call critical mass of Chinese people. So I never felt like minority. When my grandnephew did a special project on racism, he says, "Oh, Auntie, did you grow up feeling a lot of racism?" I said, "No, I felt none." Chinatown could be pretty racist too, okay? Against people who are not Cantonese, Taiwanese, for example, okay? But the government policies over time, the racism against Asian males, okay? That demasculization of Asian males, so that they end up in restaurant and laundry work, because those were considered women's work. And that is the stereotype children in Chinatown grow up with. But they know they have a way out because they go to public school.
Great.
Public school is the savior.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, believe it, right? Like, yeah, that is a great quote. Thank you. And, and how like labels like these, right, dehumanize and just really get internalized, unfortunately, in different areas. And Judy, I saw your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to add on to what Cynthia just said, but from as an Asian woman, it would be important to think about the hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women.
Yes.
There seems to be this very appealing, alluring thing with Asian women and white men. And it's fascinating to see it kind of like explode in recent years, because now you have lots of mixed race children from those relationships. But a lot of it has to do with the history of US colonialism in the Philippines, in Korea, in China, in Asian countries where not only was there violence from bombings, but rape and what they called comfort women, which was really a nice way to put rape. And so this legacy carries on into the hyper sexualization of women in popular media. But when, I think your question earlier was whether or not, we feel sort of relegated to these roles. And I think that lots of the new members of the new generation now are rejecting those roles and are, reclaiming their identity as Asian Americans, as Asians, and rejecting this kind of like stereotyping of Asian women, especially.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add to this? This is, stereotyping, these roles, it's heavy. Carl?
I think for me, it's interesting because I think in some cases, I think we also can take advantage of some of these stereotypes. And I definitely felt like I did. The stereotype of us being smart and, being really good at math and things like that, I'm completely the opposite. I am horrible at math. I can barely add, to be honest. It's pretty bad. But like, for example, one benefit would be like, I could get away with not feeling like an idiot in regards to something, because sometimes some people would assume that I understood or knew something that I actually didn't. Or with the whole martial arts thing, I actually did grow up and take martial arts. So I kind of did fit into that stereotype, and you can kind of use that to your advantage because people thought that was cool. you know, and so that kind of worked out. But in regards to career, which I imagine we'll talk about a little bit later, it's a whole different story.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you know, and I'm glad you brought up the model minority myth, because, right, I mean, it's a thing. It really is a thing. That and like perpetual foreigner. I mean, these are things that everyone, at least at some point, right, with the math class or like, hey, where are you from? Where are you really from?
Yeah,
I mean, those are the conversations.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and how have you been able to combat some of these stereotypes like the model minority myth and, you know, this idea of being the perpetual foreigner, without sacrificing your own integrity or even like your academic or your career achievements? Olivia?
I just want to say thank you, Judy, for bringing up that nuance of feminism, that other layer to it. There's actually this great novel that I read last year. It's called Good Talk by Mira Jacob. And she is a mother of a biracial son. She's married to a white Jewish man. And having lived in New York City, she explains what it's like, the difficulties kind of explaining race to a child, and also because of like the whole thing of colorism, she identifies as Indian American, and so what it's like to be brown in America post 9/11. So there's so much complexity to it, and then she even speaks about her dating life in college and instances of fetishization. Regarding being boxed in and stereotypes, I could not help but keep thinking of Brian's point earlier regarding language. Growing up in Connecticut, I've always been particular about the way I speak. And that's because since kindergarten, I was put in ESL classes. I grew up listening to broken English. So I actually know my mother tongue is Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, but I also understand Cantonese, I understand Hokkien, which is a dialect. But I have always been insecure about my English abilities, speaking, writing, reading. And so growing up, my mom would encourage me, we'd go to the library together, pick out books, and I would read them, chapter books, science books, all genres, and I would keep vocab lists and study them to broaden my vocabulary. But there's this, what I've realized is that it's okay to embrace bad English. In fact, there's this author, Kathy Park Hong. She has this book titled Minor Feelings, which I love. I recommend all to check it out. That book speaks to my heart. I mean, every other page I was highlighting, it really resonates with my lived experience. And I just want to read this one passage. She writes, "Bad English is my heritage. I share a literary lineage with writers who make the unmastering of English their rallying cry, who queer it, twerk it, hack it, cannibalize it, other it by hijacking English and warping it to a fugitive tongue. To other English is to make audible the imperial power sewn into the language, to slit English open so its dark histories slide out." And wow, that was really profound, because I realized there's no need to be insecure about this whole English thing. It actually stems from language policing. So if you hear on the news, like, go back to your country, speak English, there's this hierarchy, not only with race, but then also with English and how English is predominantly spoken. And so growing up, so I am not fluent in Mandarin Chinese, but now in college, that's my goal, to relearn it and kind of take that part of me back. And so back to the question, Yukio's question regarding perpetual foreigner. I think obviously there's these stereotypes, they exist among us. And so to be aware of it, to note it, but then not let it box you in, and to live freely and do as you please.
Right. And as you probably saw on the screen, both Cynthia and I were like, yes, that's a great book. And I like cried through a lot of it. It was a lot, but it was a great book. Thank you for bringing that up as another one that we should all read. And Brian.
Yeah, I know Carl's answer was the previous question, but resonated really hard on a few points, and definitely on what Olivia said as well. I think there is a systemic challenge that exists here as a sort of result of cultural difference, is that Asian and Eastern cultures tend to be more collectivist, and Western cultures tend to be more individualist. These are observable differences in cultural psychology, which is I majored in psychology and political science at Wesleyan, and this is something that I studied a little bit. And that I think at the same time not only makes it easier, for people to perceive such a box and to put people inside that box, but also for us to understand our own identity only via these boxes. And that's something I struggle with, growing up, observing a lot of different traditions and festivals and customs, and coming here and not having any of that. But my identity as a Hong Konger, as a Chinese person, as an East Asian, is, I think, very, and like many others, fundamentally tied to the concept of community. So it's sort of like when I'm gathering my friends, with my Hong Kong friends, right, and we have like a dinner at Mid-Autumn Festival, which is what we do every year at Wesleyan. Is that already playing into a stereotype because all Asians are huddling together? Yeah, and as Cynthia, people are very violently shaking their heads. Obviously not.
Brian, I grew up in Chinatown. Those are the best parts. Holidays, the food, everything.
Absolutely.
And in Melancholy of Race, I put on chat, she writes exactly about how being that minority is us. No need to apologize.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing that I found, I'm very grateful that I found in my short 8 years in America so far, is that I think there are a lot of other people who are similarly in the margins, as Asian, like not only like other Asian Americans or other Chinese people, but also Black and brown people and queer people, a lot of people who are fighting, I think, the pretty similar, the exact same exploitative systems as we are. I have found a very amazing home in the diverse fabric of all of these people. I think that give me that sense of community that I identify with culturally, that is a specifically cultural association to me that has been able to sort of fill that gap. And also, like I think being in these spaces and also just using my own personal stories to show other people what Asian Americans can or cannot be, is also something that has I found to have had like positive growth for me.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Cynthia?
When Carl spoke about being able to use some of the stereotypes to your advantage, I wanted to say something about code switching. When you're bicultural, you're so good at it. And you start at age 5. The American political mind took a while to get to the point of accepting that cultural diversity is a good thing. When I was growing up, the purpose of the schools in the 1950s was the Americanization. If you spoke English, spoke Chinese, you got punished. This is in Chinatown. The only one who spoke English was the teacher. We didn't know what she was saying. It was like watching a silent movie. And that's the third part I made notes about. Being able to code switch has great advantages in life because you're able to take all different perspectives. And as a teacher, my friend said, how come you're always so happy at school teaching? You don't even get burnt out. You don't even get tired. I said, I switch off. I go home, get out my tea, switch on my Korean drama. I'm in a different world, right? Switch on my Chinese drama. It's in Cantonese. I said, not only are the cultural nuances of the story Cantonese, Hong Kong drama saved my mental health, okay? So I watch martial arts. I watch modern Hong Kong dramas, right? And I said, arts saves, okay? I said, suddenly, you can call it commercial art, but it's still art. And what happened is, if you can code switch, it's really good for your mental health. It's when you feel ashamed of it, of code switching. And that's what we must teach our children, our students and our daughters and sons, not to be ashamed. It's a real plus to be able to code switch.
I love it. Thank you. And, and just listening to everyone being like, yeah, you know what? We're better than this. We are who we are and we love it. And that
Yeah, we
is
love it.
exactly the energy that we need. That is so the energy that we need.
Yeah, no apologies.
Yeah. And Judy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Olivia and Brian said about linguistic biases. I've been practicing as a speech and language pathologist for the last 17 years. And what very few teachers know is that bilingualism is actually an advantage, not a liability.
Yes.
There's still the English only movement among primarily white female teachers who feel that it's best for a newcomer to the US to just be completely immersed in the English language and give them a sort of sink or swim exposure. However, the research studies of the last 35 years have clearly said that bilingualism is an advantage. So when I see an administration at a school promote and maintain bilingualism, dual language classes, it's interesting because a lot of the very expensive private schools here in Manhattan, where most of the children are from upper middle class families, wealthy families, we're talking $60,000 a year tuitions. They're actually bringing in tutors and classroom teachers who are from the People's Republic of China to teach Mandarin Chinese to these wealthy children. Why? Because much of the world, more than half of the world's people speak Chinese. And so, the linguistic biases has always been present in my life. And I grew up feeling somewhat ashamed of being Chinese. And it really, the pride in being Chinese didn't really happen until my mid-20s. And it was something that, I had to fight against. But I would say those microaggressions that Olivia mentioned earlier are, when they accumulate, they can have as much, if not greater, negative impact on the psychological development of young children who are fighting, without knowing what they're wanting or needing, fighting to maintain their home language, their culture, their identity. And it's not surprising when an adult of immigrant from an immigrant family feels this deep sadness that they never learned to speak or read or write their home language, such as Chinese or Japanese or Filipino. So this hopefully will reverse because more and more young people are wanting to learn their parents' language when they are not being provided that opportunity in formal education.
Yeah, thank you. And I was a former Japanese language teacher. And so I really appreciate, right, that difference between, when a family that speaks a different language is being forced to stop speaking that home language versus you have the privilege, right, of, learning this other language. And so, yeah, no, thank you for bringing all that in. And, I try with my daughter, but it's hard when it's your own kid. But I'm taking notes from Olivia and Brian and young people to make sure that I keep that in the back of my head to always make sure that she is proud of who she is and, in speaking and learning all these different things. And so, thank you all for sharing all of that. And, and just going back to the book a little bit of, Willis, the character is always trying to get the better acting roles, but he's seemingly having to just fight by himself on his own to try to progress. And he doesn't necessarily have, right, people around him being like, hey, if you do this, you can get this role, or here are some other ways of thinking of how to get a new role. And he's really just, just doing it on his own. But as leaders in your own communities, as organizers, as educators, as parents or aunties or uncles or who, what are you guys, or not guys, sorry, what are you all, what are some of the tangible ways that you're opening doors and helping other Asian Americans progress, and come into, your greatness that you have and being like, yeah, I'm who I am. I love it. I'm curious to know. Thank you, Carl.
I think that Cynthia probably will really relate to this too, or anybody else really. But I feel like one of the big things that help is having more stories being told and heard, and having Asian writers, tell their stories, Asian directors, producers, and things like that. And as an actor, if I'm not that person, but if I could, I would create my own work, and that would be, serve the same purpose. And I think it's because of these books, it opens so many doors. I'm part of a book club, and this is my first year in a book club, and they read a book called Last Night at the Telegraph Club. I can't remember the author, but I was like, wow, I don't think I've heard, these type of Asian American stories before. Like, I know my own story, but I haven't heard that one. I don't relate to that, but guess what? That's part of the diversity of all of our differences and in our experiences as being Asian American. I felt like so empowered by that. And I also want to mention like how when I was a child, I said that I didn't really struggle with identity in the same way as I do now, because I know more now. And now that, like, for example, when Fresh Off the Boat came on television, that's an Asian voice, Asian perspective, Asian story, maybe not my own, but for some reason, it occurred to me then, wait a minute, if I had seen this when I was growing up, my confidence level would be completely different than what it is today. And so it is very important for people like Cynthia to write what she does. And I guess for me, I'm no longer an actor, but for me to try to find these roles didn't exist, unless Asian people wrote them for me, because all the roles were really just like in the book. I was the delivery guy. I was, the dead ninja on the ground, things like that. Like every single film or television show filmed in New York City, probably 10 years, in the 10 years I lived there, I was in the background doing something like that. So it's important for people like Cynthia and other writers and directors.
Can I tell you something, Carl? There's a Facebook group called Asian American Theater Artists Network. You can join it. It's an open group. Mm-hmm. I'm part of that group. Cool. Okay.
Awesome.
I'm not an actress, but I'm a ham. I'm a retired teacher. I should be lying on the couch. Okay. But I keep getting like this thing, and then my college professor friend who is Italian, Roman, speaks more Mandarin than I, and invites me. This is the third year, so I talk to youth on colleges, and they're required to read my stories. So that's one of the things I do, is put yourself out there. And my story, No Secret, about a prostitute in Chinatown who was white, who serviced the stranded old men of Chinatown, stranded by the Communist Revolution and the Chinese Exclusion Act. The story is called No Secret. It's required reading in a Chinese history class at Boston University. Okay, so my stories get out there through theater and dance and music. I don't even have a book. I just have a website, because it's free, it's accessible. And guess what? When artists come into Chinatown and they want to do art projects that are paid for by the city, the government is funding. It's actually good to be Asian now. Okay. Young white males are having a hard time getting a job, okay? And I'm not saying we need to pity them, okay? But funding says you must do something related to community work, okay? So Carl, there's possibilities for you. All those artists, read my stories, contact me to take them on an insider's tour of Chinatown. I influence their art. There's all kinds of arts in Boston's Chinatown that has my influence on it. Great. Structures, dances, movies. Okay. Great. So there are ways to I'm supposed to be retired. I'm not supposed to be out there. Okay. And I am.
So yeah, I think I put in the chat earlier, Cynthia's HudsonStreetChronicles.com. That's a place that you can go to read all these stories and see the different projects. But thank you. And I see Judy, I think you had your hand up.
I don't want to neglect to thank the people watching this webinar right now, because given that Groton's Asian population is only 5%, I imagine that those watching this webinar right now have a deep and authentic curiosity to know about the Asian American experience. And those of us here on this panel coincidentally speak perfect English. However, there are Asian Americans who are recent immigrants who are also Asian Americans, and they may not be able to communicate well in English with you, but there are opportunities beyond just the limited opportunities you might have in your town of Connecticut, beyond just interacting briefly with the person at the Chinese takeout or at your local laundry or at the local grocery store if a Chinese or Asian person works there, beyond going to your local Chinatown or your nearest Chinatown, beyond traveling to China. You may want deeper insight into the Asian American experience. And it should be stated that Asian Americans have been in this country for 170 years, since the 1850s, since the beginning of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the mining for gold in the West. So there's a very long history, and I highly, highly recommend a book by Iris Chang called The History of it's a book on Asian American history. She was the author of a book called the Nanjing Massacre, Iris Chang. And there are many, many good short videos and documentaries about Asian American history. So I highly recommend you, I commend you for your curiosity about the Asian American population and our experience here in the US, which is changing, especially now, given the last year and a half of the pandemic and its ramifications in the way other Americans interact with Asian Americans.
Great, thank you. Brian, you have your hand, yeah?
I am an organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America, in the same organization that the squad belongs to, famously Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the organ endorsed Bernie Sanders. I'm active with a chapter here in Connecticut, and there's, I think, including myself, 3 Asian Americans in the entire chapter, which is not ideal, but I think is like there are people here. We're working on growing those numbers, and I think. I mean, at least from my experience, and I think there is not perhaps that there's truth in the stereotype, but the stereotype is describing, I think, something that is already present, which is, at least in my experience, and Wesleyan political and activism circles, I think are often seen as very detached from like the academic and very detached from just everything else, as especially from the experiences of Asian Americans. And I have no doubt that this is also a consequence of prior Asian American struggles with the might of the U.S. state, and there are a lot of us working at many levels to try and raise people's, I think, political awareness, political consciousness of the interlocking systems that perpetrate, Asian American racism. And I am involved with like a dozen other folks right now trying to organize a specific caucus under the national DSA just for Asian Americans, specifically looking at labor organizing in Asian American circles, which, especially back in the day, a lot of migrant labor came, undocumented labor, massive problem. And it was actually through, being able to be organized in labor unions. Very famously, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, were the first and only union at the time to accept Chinese workers into their ranks and Asian workers into their ranks. And I think we need to, I think those of us who are Asian, who are really present in these fields like myself, we need to also be cognizant of how I think enhancing just the overall diverse is I don't think it's as much about enhancing like the numbers of people who look like me as much as it is about increasing the overall diversity of the entire workplace you're doing, and really building a place with the fundamental conditions that allow anyone to feel welcome. Because I think just that is the broad systemic view that is the correct thing to do. And that is something that I've been striving towards.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's, organizing is hard, and organizing, and, it's about hearts and minds and the collective, and sometimes that goes against the the American individualism. So thank you for doing what you are doing through your political organizing. And I think a lot of times Asian Americans are left out of this conversation around politics, but we are the fastest growing population, and we need, right, to really understand how can we start influencing policies and legislation and laws. Those are hard things and skills that you don't necessarily get at school. So then where do you go to get it? So Brian, please continue to do what you're doing. Please, make civics, right? Like cool again. Is that bad for me to say? Am I too old to say cool?
I'm actually about to start a job where I'm going to attempt to do that. So pretty on point.
Hey, you are all our future. My generation did a certain amount of work in the 60s and 70s, and you are our future.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And I am so glad that you are out there.
But you can't relax yet, Cynthia. You can't relax yet. There's still lots of fight in you. So
when you talked to me, I was at a bubble tea cafe going, why am I so busy? I got Violetta from Emmanuel College. I got Yukio from here and Kevin from here. I said, am I supposed to be retired?
You should be, but
we don't have to worry about her relaxing.
There's lots of stuff to do.
Oh, you can sort of tell, huh? Don't give up the acting and the playwriting. We need you.
Olivia.
Okay?
Yeah.
I work with a lot of BU actors and playwrights.
So let's hear from Olivia.
I want to say, Cynthia, us young people currently organizing, participating in this work, we stand on the shoulders of giants that have come before us and paved the way. To answer the question, this has been such a beautiful conversation. I have a few notes jotted down. First being Subtle Asian Traits, the Facebook group that I'm a part of, and I thoroughly enjoy.
I love that.
And in regards to the previous question regarding stereotypes, from a psychological standpoint, it's easier to box people in, and it takes more heart and intention and compassion to break that stereotype on a interpersonal level and get to know someone. I'll leave it at that. And then to answer Yukio's question, I say mentorship is key. I would not be in this very privileged place at this school pursuing higher education if it wasn't for my family and the teachers that saw potential in me, especially that kindergarten kid in ESL class helping me along the way. So doing what you can to give back always. Me seeking mentorship from others, especially Asian American women. I'm part of this organization, this mentorship group. It's called Aspire. It stands for Asian Sisters.
I know Aspire.
Participating in Reaching Excellence, based in Boston. They're wonderful. Currently in their fall mentorship program, and they're hosting a women's conference. So if you don't identify as Asian American woman, doesn't matter, you're an ally, go ahead and sign up for the conference, because really great material. I've learned a lot at last year's conference. And then also to the youngsters, giving back to youngsters, seeking out programs where you can, host arts and crafts sessions, whatnot, just kind of taking my lessons that I learned and imparting that on someone else. That way they can have less of a hard time.
And I thank you again, Cynthia, right? You as the giant that we stand on.
No,
But I love
I stand
hearing-
on the shoulder of my laundryman grandfather.
Yeah. No, we are
Who
here
ran a
because of everyone
laundry
before us.
in the Sicilian section. One comment that Olivia reminded me of about mental health. Asian American women and men can suffer some issues with mental health because in the Asian community, it's not okay to have a mental health problem. And also because of the oppression that is just part of our structure. But mental health is directly related to the options a person feels they have. And we are very lucky because we are bicultural, okay? Being bicultural, maybe being bilingual, I can speak 2 dialects, 3 dialects of Chinese. And that gives us options. I can switch off. Okay, I can go to my Cantonese, my Taiwanese way, which is a lot of swears, and I can just switch off. We are lucky. So we have to teach our children that it's a benefit to be bicultural, bilingual, because they're not getting that necessarily in school.
Yeah.
Because the kids who are monolingual, the kids who are monocultural, monolingual are shaming them. And you have to be louder than that voice.
Great. Yeah. And, and I appreciate every single one of you who are opening doors, not just for you, but for everyone else and holding it open so that others can come through with you. So thank you everyone for just being there, doing this work, opening doors, letting people through and welcoming them with open arms. And Judy, was that your hand that I just saw? And we haven't gotten to a lot of these questions, but I love how rich our conversation has been. And I think we're going to wrap up soon so that we can take some questions from the attendees. So attendees, if you're thinking of questions, please put it in the Q&A so that we can keep track of it and make sure that we get to it. So please put it in the Q&A instead of the chat. Thank you. All right, Judy.
I wanted to share a story about my my beloved father, who was born in 1929 in rural Shanghai. And his mid-20s, he was offered a job with a British shipping company called the Alfred Holt Company, based in Liverpool, England. And they would have Chinese workers, Irish workers on this huge shipping cargo ship that would travel to all ports of call. And he would be at sea for 6 months at a time. And he told me about these rebellions on the ship against wage theft, because oftentimes the Chinese were being pitted against the Irish workers, and but the company basically didn't pay them for months at a time. And so there were these like untold stories of rebellions on the ship. He came to the US and faced a lot of racism, being somebody who had only a 6th grade education, but was self-educated. He's a self-taught historian, but all his life he suffered racism, even up to when he was in his late 80s. Somebody told him once on a bus that I was on with him to go back to China. And I think the recent intensification of anti-Asian violence and racial slurs, including the murder of 6 Asian women at a spa in Atlanta, it's very much related to the media propaganda that continues today about these notions without proof that the coronavirus was created in a Wuhan lab. Even the former CDC director, I think his name is Redfield, he continues to perpetrate this myth, this lie, that the virus was created in a lab in China, and that China deliberately is spreading this virus throughout the world, which is a rather disgusting anti-China, anti-international effort to start a war with China. And it's what's causing the anti-Asian violence, and which continues, and we should all be outspoken about that, because we cannot continue in a world with such belligerence towards other countries.
Thank you. I know the violence has been real. And, it has been a really tough 1.5 to 2 years. I don't know how long it's been at this point. But, and Cynthia also did mention, right, the mental health issues in our community and how it's not something that is talked about or modeled how to really, live through that and work through it or treat it. And so, it really has been all around, physical, mental, emotional. It's taken a drain on us. But I know looking here on this panel that there have been so many moments of joy and so much pride in who you are and all the celebrations that you continue to do. So before we wrap up and start taking questions from our attendees, I would love to hear, all the ways that you're still having fun and having, moments of joy and doing what you do. Cynthia, you're always smiling. I love it.
I have the greatest joy when I'm eating Asian food. I was on the Cape for 7 weeks. And I go, oh, I really have to have Asian food. And my nieces had a party for me because I just won a fellowship. And it was dim sum. And I hadn't had dim sum in 2 months. And I said, oh my God, dim sum. It wasn't like the highest quality dim sum, but for me, it was like the best. So I grew up in Chinatown. Christmas was not important. Chinese New Year was, Harvest Moon Festival was, all those, and I was never ashamed of it because I was in a Chinese world. And I think there's a lot to be said for that growing up.
Thank you. And, having been in places where I've always had access to Chinatowns and dim sum and all the delicious bakeries, like I will still make the drive back to Boston to get all the delicious stuff.
Sushi. I just had lunch with my friend. She's Malaysian, and we went to Soup Shack. And Olivia, she tells me Singapore is nothing compared to Malaysia has the very best food. And Brian, my Hong Kong niece says, oh, you're in Hong Kong. And I would say, you have to have the bolo bao and the nai cha and the dan tat, and we had the classic 3. And then we had to go to dim sum in Hong Kong. So I just ate my way through China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And then I come back to Boston. It's not quite the same quality, but I live in Alston. So it's Koreatown. So yeah. I basically, I celebrate by eating food with people I really love and care for.
Yeah. And how about everyone else? How do you find moments of joy and celebrate you and your communities and doing what you love? Carl, is that a big smile I see?
Sure.
Dim sum.
I mean, I completely agree with Cynthia. And I lived in New York for 12 years, and that's one of the biggest things I miss, other than my friends, is the food. And that is always like a way to bring people together, the holidays, the Asian holidays, and the Asian friends I have there. And so I can still feel like I'm part of, that culture and heritage and everything. But now that I'm in Orlando, it's not quite as, it's not the same. It's really almost non-existent. So I'm actually very much missing that part of my life. However, luckily I do have my sister here. And so, we kind of have to secretly meet to celebrate, I guess. But there's not as much down here unless it's like super commercial, good, celebrate Chinese New Year and Disney or something, Other than that, it's my sister.
Oh, family and food, right? And I'm sure there's laughter mixed in there too. So, oh, thank you. I know food is like my love language as well. So Brian, what about you?
My response is going to tie it to a little bit a question that we didn't get to tonight, but it's the relationship between Asian Americans and non-Asian American POC and white allies, and that was just referencing back to the fact that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Especially in my work, I'm reminded of people like Grace Lee Boggs, like Yuri Kochiyama, just absolutely courageous, fearless people that stood without any reservation in solidarity with everyone else that was struggling at the time, no matter their skin color, no matter their beliefs. And I have found in my time here, as someone that is here without like family, my family's all the way back home, sometimes I have found that there is actually even more joy in finding community that accepts me for who I am, and not just because I look like them. Of course, that part is amazing, and I will always come back to it. I'm sure I'm really glad to have those pockets of community to return to. But the idea that I've been able to find other family here by standing in solidarity with them. And this reminds me of a Chinese saying, and also the name of a Cantonese song that I really like, 同舟共濟. Cynthia and Olivia may know what this is, but I'm about to put that in the chat, and you look it up. But this is essentially, it literally translates to going through the struggle together in a boat in a storm. To me, that is really just like what the essence of Asian American and solidarity and all of this really means. So
Great. And chosen family is still a valid family, right? Like, it doesn't have to be biological. Family comes in all forms. So yeah, as you know, I also have family abroad, and yeah, you're right. Family is family, chosen or biological or whatever, it is family. So thank you. Olivia? Oh, sorry, you were drinking.
All good. I love this question because with the organizing and with everything, pride, joy, and celebration is key to self-preservation, self-care, coming together as a community. I would second Cynthia's food, of course. Boba, sushi, anything. I mean, I literally have mochi in my mini fridge over there next to my desk. I mean, my family is like, what, 40 minutes away, and then overseas, hours away, kilometers away. Phone calls to family just to check in. And then, yes, what Brian was saying, cross-racial healing and solidarity. I mean, if we're getting really into it, what was I going to say? White supremacy. It's a hierarchy founded on anti-Blackness, and it's collective liberation, and so it's all about together. So without Black liberation, there's no collective liberation. So it's a together situation that we tackle this together. That was not eloquently put, but
no,
our struggles are interconnected. We have this struggle.
Yes.
Rooted in capitalism,
look at Brian.
imperialism,
Brian.
patriarchy, queerphobia, transphobia, ableism. So it's together we stand. That's all I have to say.
It's about human value.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for saying all of that. Oh,
thank you. See, you're a hope for the future. You, Brian, Carl, Judy, you're younger than me. So and of course, Yuki, you are. So I want to lie down and drink my bubble tea. So no, you guys,
you can't yet. You can't.
You are the hope for the future.
Do.
My October calendar's so full, and I just said, "How did this happen?"
Oh, all right. So Judy, I know we have like 10 more minutes left, and that's it. But go ahead, Judy.
The joys. Well, I've been working in a middle school in Chinatown where 80% of our student population are Chinese. And so being Chinese American myself, I really relate to them. And I would say one of the greatest joys recently is I started an Asian American Heritage Club at my school, and students are interested. And I've been reaching out to various civic organizations like the Organization of Chinese Americans, the Chinese American Heritage Foundation, and there are so many. And like somebody said earlier, we stand on the shoulders of giants because so much has changed so radically in just 3 generations. My parents' generation were the pioneers of the 1970s and 80s, and then I being from the 1990s, I suppose, and now Olivia's generation and Brian's generation are paving the way for a more pluralistic and internationalist society. And I couldn't agree more, Olivia. I loved when you said there's no liberation until there's Black liberation, because the Black Asian solidarity has to be there with white allyship. And there's so much to say in so little time. Linguistic preservation, there are many Pacific Island languages that are at risk of extinction. We have to fight harder to preserve languages that are at risk of dying from the English-only movement. So I really do hope that we can continue to help each other explore different ways to learn about each other's culture, language, holidays, traditions, and create international peace and solidarity, not just here across states, but around the world.
Great, thank you. This has been such a wonderful time. I don't want to end this. Like, this has been so amazing to meet you all and just be in this space. So thank you so much for being so open and so honest and so, just thorough with all your experiences. So with that, it is 7:54, and unfortunately this only goes until 8 o'clock. Julie, we had a question from Julie. What can be done to make communities safer for Asian Americans? I know Cynthia and Judy chimed in through the text, but if anyone else wants to just take this one on, it's a big question. Yes, Brian.
I think it's kind of really hard to give very specific suggestions. Obviously, there are very varying conditions everywhere and very varying needs of different Asian Americans. But I think following a line that Olivia started, which I think is absolutely brilliant, I think building a strong multiracial working class movement that really provides that safety net that all of us need. The Asian American wealth gap is something that everyone should look up after this and read into if they haven't heard yet about it. But that exists across every race and gender, and people are really suffering right now, especially out of the pandemic. And I think participating in your community mutual aid collectives. I know there's a very, very famous one in New London that has been doing an absolutely amazing work helping out the community at this time. I think even small efforts like that and exposing yourself to the real people in the community, that is not just in your bubble, is really important.
Thank you for the additional comments. Yeah, and like Olivia said, right, collective liberation, because the same oppressive system against our Black and brown brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, sons, daughters, like all of that applies. It shows up differently, but it does apply to all of us. And until there is that collective liberation, it is going to be so hard to just say, hey, what about this one community? How do we make that one community safe? So it has to have a wider lens, and so appreciate, all of you for chiming in on this. Thank you. All right, so 7:56 already. Let's bring back Kevin. He's going to close it out for us. But again, thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much, Yukio. Oh my gosh, it was a phenomenal discussion. Thank you so much for moderating this event, and all of you for being on the panel this evening. As Judy Chang said earlier, Asian Americans have been in this country for 170 years. We have to continue working together to defeat these exploitative systems that hinder us in so many ways. These courageous conversations that bring awareness to Asian American solidarity, this is where it begins, because family comes in all forms, as Yukio said earlier. As Cynthia Yee said, bicultural and bilingual gives you options. We must have collective liberation because our struggles are interconnected. This was a powerful discussion and something that when you think about it, that's what brings us all together and united as one. And one thing I kept thinking about during this discussion is, as Margaret Cho says, the power of visibility can never be underestimated. The power of visibility can never be underestimated. And this was such a powerful event. And this is a powerful event that the world needs to see. Because, as you know, I just think of this quote that when you make an observation, you have an obligation. And this entire discussion today is about making sure all voices are being heard, because we have to come together as one in order to fight the system that exploits us on so many different levels, exploits all of our different cultures. So I want to thank you, Brian. I want to thank you, Yukio. I want to thank you, Carl. I want to thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Olivia. And if you can cross your arms like this, I know we're in a Zoom call. I'm giving you all a hug. I appreciate your determination, your fight for social justice. You are phenomenal individuals, powerful individuals, and you continue to uplift your people. I just love it. You rejuvenated me and inspired me on so many levels, because it's so true. It's all about coming together. We have to come together as a community, all of us, all of our cultures like that. And it's because we have one cause, and this is what it's all about. So I thank you so much. I really do. Just thank you so much for your selflessness and your power just to continue moving forward, because this is what it takes. You know, you are phenomenal individuals.
We
So
have
I
to
just want to say
keep
that,
them together.
yes, I just want to say it again. So for anyone else who's interested, again, you know, please come on Tuesday, October 5th at 7 p.m. at the Garda Arts Theater in New London. If you want to meet the incredible author, Charles Yu, he will be in attendance. And assistant professor of East Asian languages and culture, she's going to be there moderating this event. So please come, Professor Takamaru, please be there, because it's something, if you enjoy this discussion, you could definitely hear from the person who wrote this incredible book.
Kevin, I'm kind of too far away, but I'm sure you report back to me. And I'm already tired anyway. But the great thing about Charles Yu, he did not grow up in a Chinatown.
Wow.
He grew up in Irvine, California. It's a mythical Chinatown. That's why I love this book. It is so clever, so smart, and he's a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
He didn't start up. He suffered many failures. I'm trying to accept that. Many rejections, right? He's a lawyer. He wrote part-time. And I'm sure his Asian parents told him to give it up and be a good lawyer and make good money, right? But if he can understand Chinatown, so I can see it like San Francisco with those SROs, he did not grow up in a Chinatown, then certainly people who did not come from a Chinatown or do not understand Asian culture certainly can't understand it like Charles Yu did. He did not grow up with a lot of Chinese culture. He's Taiwanese, for one thing. From Irvine.
Right. Well, thank you again, everyone. And again, I'm so honored to have shared this space with you all. And thank you, Kevin, for organizing, and Groton Public Library for hosting. And, you know, I look forward to the day that we can all come together and share food and, you know, be chosen families, hopefully, maybe. I don't know, is that too soon in the relationship?
And Carl, don't give up. Carl, don't give up. And Brian and Olivia are going to keep carrying that torch.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, attendees, for being here for the full hour and a half.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Yuki, for moderating. You're doing a super job.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me. I never hardly ever go to Connecticut, so this has really been fun.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Groton Public Library.